This happened to me a couple of years ago when I was renting a small apartment on the second floor of a 5-story building in Chicago. The small residential complex where all the apartments were rented out seemed completely ordinary. Everyone knew each other, greeted each other when they met, and sometimes even had barbecues in the yard. But one of my neighbors was different, a quiet, secretive person who lived through the wall from my apartment and never interacted with anyone. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. Just another introvert, I thought at the time, who preferred to keep to himself. Nobody knew him. Nobody saw him with other tenants. Sometimes I even thought he didn't exist at all because there was never any sound coming from his apartment. But one day something happened that made me pay attention to this neighbor. I came home late at night after a party at a friend's house and heard a strange sound coming from his apartment. At first I thought it was just my imagination, like someone was scraping the wall. It lasted for a minute or two, then stopped. Tired, I didn't think much of it, but the next day I heard the scratching again, more clearly. I paused the movie I was watching and tried to listen closely. The sound was coming from the wall adjoining his apartment, and it sounded muffled, like someone was carefully scraping the wall from the inside. Then the sound abruptly stopped. I thought it was just an old building. We had problems with the pipes, and sometimes there were clicks from the old heating system. A few days passed, and nothing like that happened again, until one evening when I noticed a strange, flickering light from his window. My apartment faced the opposite side of the building, but when I went out for a walk in the evening, his window was at eye. Usually it was always covered by curtains, but that night they were slightly raised, and I saw a faint light. It looked like a small lamp was on, and something was thrown over it to dim the light. My friend Jessica, who sometimes came to visit, also noticed the oddities. One evening, when we were sitting and drinking coffee, she told me that she had seen the neighbor carrying something like an old TV or a box. She didn't see his face because he was wearing a hood, but she was intrigued as to why he kept taking out different things that didn't look like household appliances. One night I was awakened by a strange noise, like someone was running around the room, and I realized it was coming from his apartment. The sounds went on for about 20 minutes, then suddenly stopped. Every day, I had the growing feeling that something was happening there that no one knew about. I began to think that he might have some kind of illness, or maybe he suffered from paranoia and was afraid to leave his apartment. Curiosity led me to speak with the concierge. When I asked about the neighbor, he replied reluctantly. All he could say was that the neighbor paid rent on time, didn't disturb anyone, and no one had ever complained about strange noises. I realized that the concierge didn't want to talk about it. At some point, other tenants began to hear the noises too. A few days later, the neighbor from downstairs knocked on my door and asked if I heard anything strange at night. He said that the night before he had heard muffled voices from the neighbor's apartment, followed by a loud thud, like something had fallen to the floor. I wondered if I should call the police, but decided to wait another day or two. One night, I heard a strange noise again. This time it was a knock, like someone was tapping on the wall. I tried recording the sounds on my phone, but unfortunately nothing was audible on the recording. So, I decided to check for myself. Choosing a moment when it was quiet in the hallway, I went to his door and listened. No sounds. The door looked ordinary. Except for one thing, there were strange scratches on the door frame, as if someone had tried to scratch it. Maybe the previous tenant had done it, or perhaps the neighbor himself. The next day, I went outside and noticed a strange light from his window. This time the light wasn't dimmed, but rather bright, and it seemed to be coming from something other than an ordinary lamp. It was almost white, like it was coming from old medical equipment. I couldn't understand what it was, but I felt a sense of unease. A few days later, the light was gone, and a couple of weeks later, the concierge told me that the neighbor had suddenly moved out, leaving the apartment empty. Everything seemed strange. He had left at night without telling anyone, and his belongings were taken by some strangers, or so I was told. But a few days later, I heard the same strange sounds from his apartment, the familiar scratching, dull footsteps, and at night, I noticed the same flickering light from his window, as if someone was still living there. As the days went by, my anxiety grew, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the concierge and asked for permission to inspect the apartment under the pretext that I had been hearing noises and was worried. At first he hesitated, but I must have convinced him. We went to the door, and he opened it. Inside, there was silence and dim light, as if no one had lived there for a long time. I walked into the bedroom, the very room where the strange sounds used to come from. When I looked closely, I noticed faint scratches on the walls, as if someone had scraped them with their nails. It was a distinct, unsettling pattern, running from the door to the far corner of the room. And then, at the very edge of the wall, I noticed a small piece of paper, slightly protruding from a crack in the baseboard. I pulled it out, and, seeing the writing, I felt my hair stand on end. The paper had been scribbled in a careless hand, with the words, "Help me, I'm here." Out of fear, I quickly stepped back, and my throat went dry. I left the apartment without saying a word, and from that moment on, I never returned to that place. I moved out a week later, leaving that strange room behind, but to this day, I still sometimes hear the faint, terrifying scratching sound in the dead of night. I live in a suburb of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the houses are spaced far apart and the street is generally quiet. My neighborhood has always been calm, and people here usually keep to themselves. However, one of my neighbors started to make me uneasy. This neighbor, George, was older than me. I first noticed him when I moved to the area. He lived with his wife, but he rarely left the house, always staying in his garage. His house was a bit old-fashioned, as was the garage, which looked like it had been built a long time ago, but George was always working in it. Sometimes he'd be in the garage during the day, but more often it was in the evening. These late-night repairs seemed to go on for hours. I, like anyone else, was curious about what he was doing, but he never invited anyone into his garage, and rumors around the neighborhood said he didn't like talking to people. At first, I wasn't bothered by the fact that George was often working in the garage, since people usually keep busy with their own projects. But over time, I started to hear strange sounds coming from his garage in the evenings. At first, I thought it was just the noise of tools, but then I began to hear something more. Occasionally, there were sharp sounds that almost sounded like screams. They were short, indistinct, but definitely resembled a human voice. The sounds were unnerving, as if someone was crying out in pain or trying to break free from something, but I couldn't make out any words. George was a reclusive man, and I wasn't sure if I should ask him about what was happening in his garage. Nevertheless, the strange sounds continued, and my curiosity grew. This went on for several weeks. One night, when the strange sounds were coming from the garage again, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to walk over to his house. It was around 11 p.m. when I stepped outside and started walking toward his yard. I noticed that the garage light was still on, and through the window, I could see George's figure at a workbench. He was tinkering with his tools, and the same strange sounds were filling the air, loud, grating, and almost like screams. I decided to stand for a moment, hoping to make out what was happening in the garage. Suddenly, the garage door creaked open slightly, and I saw a shadow emerge behind George. It was a figure that looked like an old man with a crooked, labored gait. He was very short, and seemed to move slowly, as if he had trouble walking. I thought it might be a relative of George's, maybe an elderly relative, but then something odd happened. The figure stopped just inside the garage door and seemed to be waiting for something. I was too far to hear any conversation, but it looked like the old man said something to George. At that moment, I felt a surge of unease and decided to turn around and go back home. In the following days, I continued to notice George working in his garage, but now I was paying closer attention to what was happening. Again, I heard the same sounds, but this time they were louder and more desperate. It was definitely not the noise of regular work, honestly. I couldn't understand what was going on in that garage. The next day, I decided to walk by George's house again, hoping to see something that would explain it all. When I got closer, I noticed the garage door was open, and through the gap, I could see that the garage was empty. There was no sign of George or the old figure. But something about the place didn't feel right. On the floor near the workbench was a piece of fabric that looked like old clothing. I moved closer and saw that it was a men's suit, lying right next to where George's tools had been. I stepped back, feeling a rising sense of anxiety. By this point, I was certain that whatever was going on in George's garage wasn't ordinary. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe George was helping an old man. Maybe the figure was just a relative with health problems. But the sounds I had heard couldn't be explained away that easily. They were too sharp, too unnerving to be just ordinary cries of pain or fear. The next morning, I decided to walk by George's house again, hoping to see something that would make sense of all this. I approached the garage and the door was shut. There were no signs of activity. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed an old newspaper lying on the porch, discarded. I picked it up and saw that the headline was about an unsuccessful suicide attempt by an elderly man found in the same neighborhood. The article said he had been found in a house, and that he had often complained of pain and loneliness in his final years. I froze, realizing that this could be connected to what was happening in George's garage. What really struck me, though, was the photo accompanying the article. It showed the same old man I had seen in George's garage, with his crooked gait and strange figure. I realized that it was the same person. And if that was the case, then who was in the garage with George that night?